In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Walt Whitman. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. In the writing, I find this to be much livelier than it did in the swatch, which looked a bit dull and especially muted as a tone. I wasn't too fond of it in the swatch. There's plenty of tone variation that you're going to get by pen, and more than enough shading to go around. Now, it's not going to be that camouflage shading, but it shades very nicely. This isn't an outspoken color that distracts from what you're writing, but it still brings an extra bit of attention to what you have written. I feel a bit sad that it's used up, and I do plan on getting another sample just for a couple more days of getting to write with it. I found that the color was pleasing on pretty much every paper that I used it on, and even from every pen. Though I do wind up with some preferences in the end, but don't we all? I'm going to say that this is a green that deserves a lot more attention. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Cross Bailey with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the posting nib, it is a nice light green, and it is not too light to read. So it's almost a grass green, a dark, rich grass. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. You do see some shading going on, but this is a very dry, very fine pen. If you look at the end of bodies on the top line, look at the word that, the, book. Every bit of it is giving shading, and that's hard to do with a pen this dry. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, we see it's much darker than we had with the posting nib. We get no feather, we get no spread. Now, while we have a lot more of that darker tone, it definitely shades a lot, and very nicely. It's going just about 3 or 4 different tones off of itself, which I think is very nice, which is the reason that I said I didn't find it distracting from what I've written, but definitely does make it look good. The Architect nib is lighter than we had with that Aero Fine, but darker than we had with the posting nib. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, we're getting the best showing of shading here, which does make me kind of wish that I was using it in a stub nib just to really see what would happen there. I think this could look especially nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get almost no ghosting and absolutely no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done a TWSBI Vac Mini with a posting nib. A TWSBI Eco with an Aero nib that is fine. A TWSBI Mini with an Architect. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the posting nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. Now, we're not getting any feather. We're not getting any spread. I think the shading shows itself a little bit better with this paper. Probably for being a little bit more absorbent, it is pulling enough of the ink down to look pretty nice. This is doing very well here. Though a posting nib isn't best for a reporter notebook, I think it would work very well. The Aero Fine nib is quite a bit darker than the posting nib. We're not getting any feathering. We're not getting any spread. We're getting plenty of shading, not something this paper does all the time. This looks very nice. I actually think this is the nicest tone that we're getting on this paper, and it's going to fairly well hold out through it, but this green, perfect. Looking at the Architect nib, it is just a little bit lighter than we had with the Aero Fine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades. It's amazingly. Look at it. It speaks for itself. Just enjoy its goodness. Now, I'm not good with an Architect nib, and I really can't write in print. I would suggest using print with the Architect. It would look much better. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, we're still getting a very nice light green, easy to read, no real problems. We're not getting any feather. We're not getting any spread. We're getting a little bit of shading still coming through. So even on a more absorbent paper, this ink shades so well that it shades on paper that's not made for fountain pen, which we really don't always get to see. Very nice. The Aero Fine nib is a bit darker than we had with the posting nib. We get no feather. We get no spread. We're not really getting much shading. You can see it there in a few spots. But the darker tone of this ink from that pen combined with the absorbency of the paper makes almost all of its shading go away. I can live with that in a reporter book. I can, although I do like seeing the shading. Looking at the Architect nib, welcome back shading, first of all. Now, we get no feather, we get no spread. The tone itself is very similar to what we had with the posting nib, just much wider lines. This, I do think, looks very good. I think it's performing very well here. I'm going to take back the no feather part because as we move along, and you're going to see in the name hook, and when the last line comes up, the word society, you're going to see a lot of feathering that starts to occur there, but it's not all over the place. Looking at the back of the page, you see that We get very little ghosting. Any spots that look deep, it did not come through and touch the page underneath, so you could use the next page. You could even use the back of the page without a problem. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, nice, refreshing green tone, easy to read with no feather, no spread, only the tiniest hints of some shade spots. And to be honest, where they are almost makes me feel like there might be some very deep ink into the paper in these cases. Regardless, I do see this working very well on this paper. This paper does have a tendency to perform very well with inks, although flat looking a lot of times for their color. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, it is a lot darker than we had with the posting. We're not getting any feather, we're not getting any spread, and yes, we still get the shading. This paper does frequently allow that shading to keep showing through, so that is a benefit of this particular pad. Looking at the Architect nib, what we get is a tone that is, on a majority, a little bit lighter than we had with the Aero Fine. We're not getting any feather, we're not getting any spread, we're getting really, really amazing looking shading. It looks so good. I almost want to call it breathtaking, but that would be a bit too far. That would be exaggerating for this, but man, this looks good. Looking at the back of the page, we get more of the regular good news with this notepad. This just in, no bleeding, no ghosting. You can easily use the back of the page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Frank Gorshin Riddle Green. Here is Geherban Violet Pence. Here is Roher & Klinger Alt Goldgrün. Here is Sailor Epinard. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the posting nib, it is a nice light green still. It's performing, I think, fairly good looking here. We get a very minimal amount of spread. We have no feathering at all and almost no shading. Now, there is some shading. When you look on the top line at the word published, it is very distinctly there. So it is there. And in the word 13 and all right, it shades. It's just not as standout as it was before. Looking at the Aero Fine nib, we get a much darker tone than we had with the posting. We have no feather, no spread. There's a little bit of woolliness when we get to the word gravitating. It's not bad at all. This paper has been the worst of the reporters, and it's handling this fairly well. There's a couple moments where there is a little bit of shade, but I won't really call this shading in its performance here. Looking at the Architect nib, the tone is about the same that we had with the Aero Fine. We do get tiny bits of feathering going on. We don't really get any spread. We definitely get some shading. I wouldn't use this on this paper, but I don't think it looks bad looking at the color. It's just the performance of the writing itself that makes me say I don't really want that. But this is a paper issue, not an ink issue. Don't blame this ink. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how deep this ink got into the paper. Now, you can't use the back of the page because of the significant ghosting. I am going to use the next page, although it looks like it's got tiny splattering, so it did touch the page underneath. I'm going to call it usable because I'm going to use that page. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here's an orange ink by Diamine. They're orange. Here is a purple ink by Levenger, Amethyst. Here is a black ink by KWZ, Warsaw Dreaming. Here is a red shimmering ink by Pen BBS, their number 235. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the posting nib, we get a little darker green than we've gotten from that pen on most of the other papers. We do get very light, incredibly light feathering, but not a problem, not something that's going to stop you from using it. We don't really get spread. Yes, there's a tiny bit, but come on, man, look at this. It's such cheap paper, and it's doing so well. And we even get a couple moments of shading, so there's a real celebration that should happen here. Looking at the Aerofine nib, it's quite a bit darker than we had with the posting. It feathers, it spreads, it does have a couple moments of shading, which almost make me worry about whether or not they would bleed through, but I'll go ahead and let it be called shading. In the end, I actually think this is done very well on this paper, considering, but it's still a fine nib. Looking at the Architect, the tone that we get is about the same that we had with that Aerofine. We get feather, very small and manageable though. We do get some spread, but very minimal and, again, manageable if you just plan for that in your writing. We even get spots of shading, which, as I said before, has me worried about how deep this ink may be getting into the paper and whether it's bleeding through. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is there. You can't use the back of the page, but this is nowhere near as bad as we've had it in the past. This is pretty good. And the surprise is nothing came through and touched the page underneath, so you could not have to worry about that. That's nice. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? For me, I enjoyed it most from a wet but not a gusher of a fine nib. I could easily see it being used in any wet pen, any nib size, really. Something else to point out, though, is with that shading, a stub, I think, would look beyond amazing. So I would be with that wet fine or wet stub and stand back for beauty. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.